some left over, but if not, see me right afterwards,
I
right?
asked, but they
No, no.
didn't have it.
Okay, I've got.
George went over to the other church, but they didn't have it.
Yeah, when we get through, I'll get her one.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome back again to uh, New Prospect Baptist Church. This time in the late 1800s, and just happy to have you all here. We're going to kind of intermingle some singing along with the story of the church. And let me say, go ahead and advance the slide there for me. There's a couple of things I wanted to catch up on from last week that I didn't get to, and one was a question that I asked, nobody else asked, but I did, is if the church had ever been used as a school. And the reason that I asked that question is because county where I live, and I have also done a little bit of research on Rabun County up in the mountains, and almost every church back in the early 1800s that was in existence served as a place for them to have a school. And it wasn't an official school. It wasn't like something that, you would, it's like a community come together. And you would have the sharpest, person, the one who could read, would be the one who would teach the other children to read. But generally, you did it at the school's meeting house. Now, I don't know if that was ever true here at our church, but I do think that it's a possibility. But I didn't realize that would be that small. But the one thing I wanted to mention to you was here about the Johnson Female Seminary. Now, seminary was the word that we at those days you'd use for school. And as far as I know, now some of you may be able to help me out here, but as far as I know, the first real formal school was the Johnson Female Seminary. Now then, they stayed active up until the Civil War. In fact, William Johnson, Dr. William Johnson, was the first vice president of the South Carolina Baptist Convention, which was founded in 1844. But he was also very active at the First Baptist Church here in Anderson. And so he started the school. He felt a need to educate, I guess, the girls. I guess he didn't worry about the guys. But so they built a school next to the First Baptist Church. And I mentioned to you last week that when the Civil War came in, they closed the school down and turned it into the a place for the currency, the treasury of the Confederacy there in downtown Anderson. When the federal government came in after the war in Reconstruction, they claimed the building and took it over. And they stayed there for the whole 10 years after the Civil War and Reconstruction. And then Dr. Johnson passed away, and so all of a sudden, they didn't have leadership. So it took a while for them to reconstitute. But Johnson Seminary is a pre-runner or prelude to Anderson College and Anderson University. So they came back and reinstituted, I think, I don't know what it says on their thing, the 1880s or 1890s, something like that. I don't know, Dr. Goodwin. Is it? Yeah, I guess that's right. And they came back and did that. But anyway, I wanted to mention that because I think that was interesting. I had not heard that before, but it is interesting. And then, like I say, if any of you know anything about schools that were around here, I did talk with them at the museum here, and they are helping me to work on that because that's something that they felt like they needed to do too. Pat, go to the next slide for me. Now, this schoolhouse here is actually part of the museum downtown. And go to the next slide so I can see exactly who is on there. The Frierson, I guess that's how you pronounce that, a school was downtown, and it was founded by Sarah Jane Frierson. She was Presbyterian, First Presbyterian of Anderson. So that school, they moved sometime mid 20th century, actually to the fairground, where now the Anderson College owns. And then when Anderson College purchased that, they moved it to the museum, and they turned it into a museum. And so if any of you know anything about education, I would be fascinated to know, because the church has played a big part in educating people. Harvard was started as a school to educate preachers. And Furman, of course, was, and other schools, and as was Anderson College. Okay, go to the next slide for me. I wanted to say something about the hymns, because for the first time after the Civil War, you started having hymn books that came into the church. Now then, Baptists started producing their own hymnals in the 20th century, but I have not heard anything where they were doing it in the Sunday school board prior to that, except in possibly periodicals. Do you remember, some of you who worked in the children's program and stuff like that back in the 50s and the 60s, you would get a little program, a little quarterly, like we would have Sunday school quarterlies today, and you got music quarterlies. And so that started at the early 20th century. But in the 1870s, 1880s, most of the hymn books and most of the songs we would have gotten into the church came by way of revivals. And you've heard D.L. Moody. You've heard the name D.L. Moody. Well, D.L. Moody was the best known of all of them, at least for most evangelical groups. But there are many, many more. He had many surrogates. He had many people that were part of his ministry. Now then, D.L. Moody actually was uneducated. So I don't know as we call him illiterate. He could read, but he did not have an education. So he was someone who started a school even though he didn't have an education. But he was a dynamic preacher, and what made the services so memorable and also made them so well attended was the music. And so in the same way we would do music today, they did the music back then. And so I have a library of hymn books, but when I look back, I couldn't find any of the earliest ones. But there's several here that actually go back way back to right after the Civil War. And D.B. Towner, the reason I picked that one out in particular, D.B. Towner was a very well-known music teacher, both secular and religious. And so D.B. Towner was up in Rome, Pennsylvania, and people would come to him to study music, including my favorite person, P.P. Bliss, who wrote It Is Well With My Soul. And he put out hymn books, and those people would take their hymn books like this, take them to the church, and and they would sell them. Go to the next one. This one is the first gospel hymns and sacred songs that was produced by P.P. Bliss, whom I just mentioned a while ago, and Ira Sankey. Now, Ira Sankey was a music leader for D.L. Moody. So he was the Cliff Barrows to D.L. Moody. They also, like I say, they had other teams that went out, and actually Philip Bliss and his evangelist, D.W. Whittle, did a revival in our area. Now, it wasn't exactly in Anderson. It was actually south of us. But here you have, this is right after the Civil War, right? So you're 1876. And here you have a Yankee officer, a veteran, who was actually part of the Sherman campaign going from, through Atlanta and all of Georgia. And he and P.P. Bliss made up an evangelistic team. And in the summer of 1876, they were preaching their way south. They ended up in Augusta, and they stayed here for about a month, maybe longer. And they had big tent meetings, brush arbor meetings, just outdoor meetings. And this was the hymn book that they brought with them in 1876. Now then, when they would make these revival meetings, they would be listening they would be not only singing to the people who were coming, they would be listening to the people who were coming sing. Because a lot of the music was what we would call folk music. Folk music was music that somebody just played on their fiddle and made up, right? So you had somebody who'd be leading singing in your church, possibly here at New Prospect, and you had a little tune or dilly that they heard somewhere, at a meeting somewhere, and they would just come together and sing it. And so between the two of them, they started publishing this music. So the music got published for the first time, and go to the next. It would be printed in Toronto. Now then, most of them, the publishers, if you notice, back it up one for me. Yeah, go back up one more. I don't know. Let's look at the next one. I think right here. Yeah, it's Chicago and New York. But in New York, it says Bigelow, if I can read that right, it says Bigelow in Maine. And Bigelow in Maine was a publisher that picked up on Fanny Crosby. And so if you look in your hymn book, William Bradbury, you'll see a lot of hymns like Jesus Loves Me, Just As I Am, Without One Plea. William Bradbury wrote the music to those tunes. But William Bradbury started a publishing company in New York City. Well, he died in 1870, and so two musicians, Bigelow and Maine, bought all of his publishing. So that publishing came out of New York City. But they had publishing arms in Chicago as well as in Canada. And so that it would be like it is here. Who can you get to publish it? They'll do it for the best price, or who has the most paper, who has ink, who whatever. And so if you look at some of these early hymn books like this right here at the bottom, let's see if I can get that to work there. At the bottom, you have actually this one. You have two publishing companies, but they would get these songbooks out. They would have two editions of it. One would have music in it, and the other would have just the words. And generally, you could buy the words for about a penny a piece. So the book would cost you like 50 cents with the music in it. And then you get the words for just a penny a piece. And so that's how they that's what they got by with the slides or whatever. They would come into church. But go to the next one for me there. Because this one actually is one of my, no, the next one more. Do one more. I'll back it up again. There we go, that one. Now then, when I went, this actually came off my shelf. I'm sure that I picked it up somewhere, one of y'all did. This is actually Stamp Baxter book. Some of you remember the old Stamp Baxter books. Now then, this is a little bit more modern. This one was published in 1940. But I found it interesting because I looked through here, and I'm going to look through here to see, hallelujah, we shall rise. They'll be shouting face to face with Christ my Savior. A lot of Fanny Crosby songs to be found in here. But I flipped through, and I found one that was quite unusual. Some of the songs we know today that are in this book and in the earlier books, some of them didn't quite make it. And I found one that did not quite make it. And if you'll look to here's An Unclouded Day. Remember that song? Unclouded Day. Lily of the Valley. I found a friend in Jesus. The Old Rugged Cross. And etc. A Wonderful Story of Love. The Way of the Cross Leads Home. Remember that one? But here's one. Go to the next one. That we decided to leave out the hymn book for whatever. Do you see the title of that? If men go to hell, who cares? I thought, well, now I know why that hymn didn't make a modern hymn books.
Was it a woman who wrote that?
No, it's a man. No, but yeah, I thought, well, that's really interesting. But I'm going to sing a couple of songs out of here, just a verse out of them, because you may or may not know these songs. But go to the next one there. Where We'll Never Grow Old. Yeah, I've heard of a land in the faraway strand. All right, I think we know that. I want you to stand together with me. Go to the next slide. It'll have the words down on there. All right. Beth, play that for us. We just got this from a revival. Here we are. I've heard of a land on the faraway strand. 'Tis a beautiful home of the soul, built by Jesus on high, where we'll never shall die. 'Tis a land where we'll never grow old, never grow old, where we'll never grow old, in a land where we'll never grow old, never grow oh, never grow old, in a land where we'll never grow old. Now, there's another hymn that's on the next page over in this hymn book, and let's see, what page number is that? 19? And the title of this is "I Would Not Be Denied." Now, then, some of you may not have heard this one before. Beth, I think, told me that she had not heard this before. When I was a kid up at Wolf Creek Church, which gave me a little bit of a view of what it might have been like to be in this church back in the 1800s, this was one of my favorite songs. And I'm going to try to sing the first verse of it, and then I'm going to ask you to sing that same verse with me again, because this is a to me, is a good song, and I always think about the old church when we would do it. Go to the next time. Yeah, here we are, Beth. Play it for me. When pangs of death seize o'er my soul, unto the Lord I cried, till Jesus came and made me whole. I would not be denied. Sing it with me, the chorus. I would not be denied. I would not be denied. Till Jesus came and made me whole. I would. Sing that chorus one more time. Just a chorus. I would not be denied. I would not be denied. When Jesus came and made me whole, I would not be denied. Let's bow our heads, and we're going to say a prayer. Johnny, would you lead our prayer for us this morning?
Dear gracious Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for the message that Hayden gave us this morning. Please be with Bobby tonight as he brings out the history of our church. And be with all of us this week. Be with those that are leaving for Boncarken tomorrow, and give us travel mercies. And bring us back again next Sunday. For us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. You may be seated. Again, that's kind of how you'd start a service after the Civil War, when we were in our building that would have sat. If you're in our cemetery and you're on the little roadway that goes to the flag, and you look headed to the flag, you go back to the left, between about where that road is and where the old part of the cemetery is where the building would have sat. And it would have faced in this direction. It would have been, we have no pictures. As far as I know, we have no pictures of it. We have to keep in mind this is the late 1800s, and yeah, they were taking pictures, but it was a big deal to get photographs. And so some of the first photographs that we get actually come in the early 20th century. But we're going we're going to start and kind of follow this. And if you have your material there with you, you can kind of follow along as we go through the history here. And I would remind you that what you have here, the first part of it, I have written. It's actually most of it, not all of it, but most of it comes from when I did a series in the Booster. And so it's just a short little snippets. The second part of what you have is from the original history that was done of the church back in the 80s. And it was never published. And if we get ready to publish something, I'd kind of like to take at least a good hunk of it, because they did a lot of work on that. So a lot of what you hear me say is not my research, but theirs. And they did a masterful job doing that. And so go ahead and flip the slide. We have the first thing here that came about. Oh, let me say that after the Civil War, we don't really have very many records, if any, of exactly what was going on here at the church. We know that the attendance probably was about in the 30s, 25, 30, 35 people who were attending. You would have only had church once a month, if then. And you would have they started Sunday school during about that time, right after the Civil War. And so Sunday school, if I understand it right, and if I've read some of the research right, both for our church and for other churches, the Sunday school was possibly not every Sunday, but on certain Sundays, depending on who they could get to teach and depending on what the circumstances were and what the weather was and everything else. It's important to note that after the Civil War, Reconstruction was really hard here. People had no money. They had everything was grown on their on farms, so that they were sharing with each other and that kind of thing. So that's what our church was like for the 10 years afterwards. And we don't really have any record. According to the work that was done in the 80s, even in the associational level, very few churches have actually made a report where they would know who was there during that Reconstruction period. In some ways, the Reconstruction was harder on us here in Anderson than the war itself was. Because as I mentioned last week, the war didn't touch us until after the war was after Appomattox, and it just barely touched us then. And so that the fact that the federal government was coming in, they controlled everything, and so that it was very, very difficult. And as I mentioned to you last week, Rutherford B. Hayes struck a deal, and he did not have the popular vote. Have you ever heard that before? But he was Republican. And a Republican, of course, who else was a Republican? Abraham Lincoln, U.S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, all Republicans. But the South had gotten enough Democrats to vote now. And, of course, before that, they were divided, Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats. But in that election, in whatever year that was, 78 or 80, no, just a minute. Yeah, in the late 70s, I think it was, 1870s. He did not have enough electoral votes to become president. So they actually struck a deal. And so that the legislature named him as president because he agreed to the Democrats' demand that the federal troops be taken out of this area. So it's because of that, then the federal troops left here, and for the first time here locally, people were able to start running their own government again. So that's where we are here about that time in 1878. There was a fire. As far as I can tell, it's the only time the church is burned. But in the summer of 1878, again, remember where the church was, and it had a picket fence that's described to being around the cemetery. And they had a fire. What happened is in March of that year, you had, at that time, people would burn off their crops. I mean, a lot of them didn't plow as much and all that kind of stuff. The best thing to do is just to burn the crops off so that they would, as the spring would come, they'd clean as best they could, and then they would set fire to the crops. So what happened on that windy day was that the fire got picked up, and so it destroyed this whole area right through here. But there were not very many homes here, but there was the church right in this area. And it leveled the church, just burned it to the ground. And so that's the only time that the church has been destroyed by fire. And that's something to say because a lot of churches have had different times when they've had fires. After that was that fire, they came together that next week, and that's what that second part will say. They came together and they agreed that they would rebuild that church. And so they rebuilt the church on the same foundation. And so I can't imagine this, but the report is that that church would seat up to 300 people. And again, you have to keep in mind that it was just a simple building, right? And they would have had benches and not pews. In fact, the benches would have been literal, benches without backs on them and stuff like that. And so that's where we are there. Flip on to the next slide. This describes it a little bit there. They basically, I think I've covered everything there. And so go on to the next slide. Now then, I wanted to put this in here because I want you to take a close look at this hymn book right here. It's the Gospel Hymns number 2. Now, I don't own that hymn book, but I wish I did. Because do you remember me telling you about Philip Bliss and D.W. Whittle did the revival campaign down here in Augusta in the summer of 1876? Well, they were pushing that book, the first edition. So they were peddling it to the churches and put to the people who attended their revivals. And so that's when, I don't know whether we got one or not, but there's a good chance that we did. So it was so successful that they decided that they must produce another hymn book. And so during that crusade in the summer of 1776, Philip Bliss, who was a fabulous singer, bass baritone singer, and he was also a great pianist, and he had a keyboard. I've actually visited that keyboard up in Rome, Pennsylvania, where there's a memorial to him there. And it's like a little portable pump organ. And he would take the pump organ thing with him, and it had little reeds on it. And you would pump it, and he would play a piano. It's a portable piano, and he would take it with him everywhere he went. And then he would listen to people's songs, and he would, notate them. So some of those songs he got that way. He got songs different ways. But he remembered a poem that had been written by Horatio Spafford. And so there's a little bit of controversy about this particular hymn, because most of the hymns that the descriptions of "It Is Well With My Soul" will talk about him being on the watery grave of his 4 daughters. You remember that? And on the watery grave of his 4 daughters, he took up the envelope or something, and he wrote, "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll." That story was told by his daughter, who was born, of course, after, because the 4 daughters drowned, right? But he had a daughter after that, 2 daughters. And in the 1930s, she told that story. But people who have gone back to study that hymn realize that he did that hymn probably at least 3 to 4 years after the event. And so we don't know exactly when it was written, but we know that Philip Bliss took that poem and he notated it, put it in the hymn book, and it would be published for the very first time in Gospel Hymns number 2. It Is Well With My Soul. So and he was getting ready to publish it. In fact, I think that they probably did publish it in the fall of 1876. And he was, I think Spafford gave him 3 or 4 different poems, and that was just one of them. And then it was then that he was kind of on a promotional tour in a way for that hymn book and some songs in it, that he went to Chicago, and on December the 29th, on a train to Chicago, you had a terrible accident where the bridge collapsed. The train collapsed into the Ashtabula River, and he and his wife and about 90 other people perished in an awful fire and every way you could die, cold, drowning, everything. That's how he did it. He drowned it at that point. So the hymn book that you see here actually survived for him to be able to, for us to know that hymn today. So I'm going to ask us to stand together. And I think Beth has already slipped away. She's gone. But if not, we can just do this a cappella, I think. Yeah, let's just stand up and sing it, would you? And go to the next slide. There it is. But we know the words, and I want you just to sing it with me, would you? When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. Thank you. You can be seated. They published that hymn book, became popular, I should say, right after Philip Bliss passed away. He sang the song one time, actually to a group of, he visited a jail, prison in Chicago. And he was at a pastor's conference. So he might have sung it at the pastor's conference, but it is said that he sang it for the first time in a prison. It is well with my soul. On his way back to Rome before he had the terrible accident. So anyway, I put that in because that gives you a time period. That's the time period that this song was written. And so for the people at this time period now, that would have been new to them. Go on to the next slide for me. Now then, we get to the fun part for tonight, and that's the dancing church members. And where's Othello? There's Othello right here. She's okay. Yeah, I put in there what different people call this. Amish call it Minadug. Minadug, is that pronounced that right? Who's a German here? I think you pronounce the second vowel sound. But we call it shunning. And by the way, just most of you know, the Amish would be, they speak German, right? And so that's what the reason you have that. But they call it shunning. Catholics, excommunicate, Jehovah's Witness, disfellowship. Baptist, they call it churching. Now then, this sounds like it'd say, oh man, that'd be way back yonder. I have actually had situations in my short ministry where the first church I served full time, might not should tell you what the name of that church is, but it was in Columbus. They actually threatened to church. They didn't call it that. One of their members. And it was a deacon who was not serving active at the time who had a place like Davis Elrod. Remember we had Davis Elrod out here? And all of a sudden, now then, it is 1973, and he's having trouble staying in business. So what did he do? Started selling beer in a store. And so the pastor was, even though he was not active deacon, he was halfway active in the church. From the pulpit, he made a big deal about it because he was selling beer in his store. And so he did what Jim Busby did. Because what happened here is Jim Busby was calling a square dance. Now then, if you're a Baptist in the 1800s, you did not go to square dances. It was sinful. In some places, if you're a Baptist in 2024, you don't go to dances, right? It's sinful, okay? And so it became a big deal. And so they threatened him with excommunication. They were going to church him. And if you look on what I gave you, I think Othello gave me this information here. It's a short little history of New Hope Methodist Church. And in that little short little history that you have in your thing after what I've written, there'll be that little history there. It will tell you a little bit more of the story of Jim Busby. Because what he said was, you don't have to worry about kicking me out. I quit. I'm going to leave. I'm going to, just no longer, don't consider me a member of New Prospect Church anymore. And he went down the road, and he said on his property, he would start his own church. So that's exactly what he did. He started the New Hope Methodist Church. Now, he didn't know it, but a lot of Methodists didn't believe in dancing either, but I guess around here they did. And so they created New Hope Methodist Church, and so New Hope Methodist Church and New Prospect Baptist Church, in a way, are sister fellowships. And so you have Larry Busby, is great-grandfather, and that's your great-great-grandfather, right? Your great-grandfather. Is anybody else kin to the? Yeah, that's what I just said. Larry is. Yeah, Larry is. But it go to the next slide there. No, go back it up. I forgot. I put on. I'm sorry. That's almost where I can't read it. But here's what happened. His son-in-law was I forget his first name, but he was a white. Yeah, now E.C. White was his boy. So what happened was that Jim Busby's son-in-law, Charles Madison White. He was also a carpenter. So together they built the church. They used material from his farm, from his land down there, on New Hope Road. and they built the church. Now then, so Jim Busby's grandson would have been E.C. White. Now then, how many of you remember E.C. White? A lot of you do. Now, E.C. White actually pastored this church in the 1920s. But mostly people remember him from pastoring which church? Oakwood. And he was the fundamentalist of fundamentalists, right? I think Oakwood is still considered a fundamentalist church. It's also an independent church, independent of the convention. And so E.C. White was the grandson of the one guy who got almost excommunicated from New Prospect Church. Oh, did he really? I never had a chance to know E.C. White. He passed away before I was here. But I think it's interesting that his grandson would come back to pastor this church during the early part of the Depression. Go ahead. And by the way, that's in the material that you have there, so you can read more about it. Now, the next thing that happened here is that J.W. Eskew, was one of the leading deacons in the church in this time period, the 1880s, the 1890s. So, some of the men, I won't name names, but some of the people, I'll go ahead. I don't think y'all mind, but Barry has been one of our leading deacons, Barry Creamer, for years and years here. Eskew would have been the Barry Creamer of that time period. He was very, very active as a deacon and as a leader in the church. People, if he said something, people paid attention. Well, they started a new association, so that the Saluda Association we had been a member of since the very beginning. But for several reasons that we don't really know why, they had started the new, it started off as, what's it have up there? Bethel Association, but then it became the Beaver Dam, which it still is today, association. So the church kind of made a big deal of the fact we're leaving the Saluda Baptist Association. And they joined the Beaver Dam Association. And according to the work that Jimmy Creamer did that you have there, I think quite a few people were not happy about that. So about 8 years later, they decided to come back into the association again. But it's interesting, when the association accepted them back in, oh, by the way, Eskew actually left the church too. So he actually joined Beaver Dam, I think, church. I probably have it up there. I think he joined Beaver Dam Church. And so for whatever he was upset about, he left. And so he influenced New Prospect to leave as well. But eventually we came back in. But for the first 3 or 4 years, we were considered a mission church, not a full-blown church, even though we were a leading Baptist church. So it's like, okay, you can come back, but here's a tap on the hand with the ruler. You didn't, just don't do it again, okay? We need your. No, I shouldn't say that. Sorry to say we need your money. But anyway, that's the time, if you ever hear the story of us leaving the association and coming back. Again, keep in mind that the church is meeting once a month. It's in a little clapboard church that has no facilities at all. May or may not have had a piano in it and had benches, but that's how the church was at that time. Go to the next slide for me. Now then, at the turn of the century, the church had some growth. And so for the first time, they were getting up there. I think turn of the century is 109 people in Sunday school. Membership, 89 was 201, our record. The giving had reached $1 per person for the first time. Oh, I like this one here. Dr. Cribb, the preacher, was paid about $8 a month. When my dad pastored Wolf Creek Baptist Church in the late 50s, he got paid $5 a week. And we had a 1958 Pontiac, brand new, that drank gas like crazy. He spent more money in gas going back and forth to Lake Mott, Georgia, than he did, and they gave. But he would always say, we never came home without vegetables in the car in the summertime. That's the same way it would have been here. But now then they need a new church. And so I'm pretty sure that this is when they moved from this side of the road, the cemetery side of the road, to the other side of the road where the old white building stood. Now then, there's a report. There's one history that was written where it mentioned after the Civil War they moved across the road, but that's the only time I can see that referenced. And so I'm pretty sure that the 1988 history has it correct in that they rebuilt on the original foundation after the fire, and then they either remodeled or had to rebuild there at that location. But then in the late 1890s, they built a whole new church. Now, the white building that we knew as a church was a modern structure back in those days. It was a radical change from what they had been worshiping in. So for the first time, you had a church that looked like a church, and it's the first time we have a church building that actually has we have a photograph of. And that building was quite ornate on the inside. If you remember, some of you can remember when you actually still met there. You had rounded. You came in, about the size of this room here, I would guess, something about this size. And you have rounded sides to it. It didn't go up like our church does to a point, but it was modern. And if you look at the baptismal area, and you had a modern thing there. You could later on they put speakers up there and et cetera. What's really cool is that a lot of you remember that building because it was razed, I think, in '09. And when I was here, forget why we had to do it or why we did it, but we had suspended ceiling in that building then because you had Sunday school space in there for a while, and they made it into a youth building, and et cetera. And I suppose we were thinking about taking out a wall. I don't remember, but we went up there and we popped the Celotex tile with a flashlight, and we looked up there. It was amazing to me that church was just like it was before they did all of the suspended ceiling. My thought was, wow, that's just kind of cool. If they get tired of using it, all you got to do is take this down and you have the old church back. Because that's what it looked like there in that church. Now, it was built very solid, and heart pine material, was used back in those days because you had old growth trees here. So anything that's built before the turn of the century generally would last forever because it actually turned into like a rock, that petrified wood almost. And so they built the church. Then you have the story here of the foundation. Now then, Jimmy Creener writes about this in his material. And the story was, Eskew, remember Eskew, the same guy that brought him out of the convention? Eskew felt really strongly that they should use, I think it was brick, whatever it says there up there. Does it say on that one there? Go to the next one. Well, you can see material. Let me say this first. The auditorium could seat 350 people. Like I said, it's kind of about the size of this building here. But then they sold the old church for scrap. Go to the next slide for me. Now then, here the controversy comes in. Eskew, he was the one, I think, who pushed for brick. And then Squire Brown felt like it needed to be fieldstone. Okay? Now then, there was actually controversy back in those days because you had brick veneer a building, like a courthouse or something like that. But you didn't want to use because they didn't have a way of firing the brick as well. So the brick would crumble after a while. So a lot of people were not trustworthy of the brick. And so what happened was it became, according to Jimmy Creener, it became a controversy. And so the church voted that they would use the fieldstone to build the columns, the foundation. So you'd have a column here, a column here, a column here, like you would in a regular house, every 8 feet or whatever it was. But they would be fieldstone. So it'd be rock solid, forgive the pun. But they also wanted to keep Mr. Eskew, what? Happy, right? And so according to Jimmy, they actually let him go in and put the brick at non-supportive places on the foundation. So I and everybody else who can remember that white building, which is most of you sitting in here tonight, if you remember looking at that foundation, what was it? Fieldstone, brick. Fieldstone, brick. Fieldstone, brick. And I used to park the pickle. I don't know if you remember that. I had a 1974 beautifully preserved Plymouth Satellite, not Plymouth Satellite, Valiant, Plymouth Valiant. My girls hated it. They always wanted me to let them out at Westside High School about a block before we got to school, But I drove the pickle, And it was green, obviously. That's the reason, so that, now their mom could take them to school, but if I were to take them to school, they would, every time, Robin, especially my youngest, and if you know Robin, she's, to this day, she's a boss, and she hated to be seen in that pickle, But anyway, I would park my pickle right next to the church. I have a little parking place there in a little cubby hole. And so I would think about it every time I would get out. So that what I did, you can flip it on to the next one, I think, is when I talk about this. I have my doubts about that. And the reason is, and I'll have to look and see, because I think that George has kept part of the foundation that we had. But you remember I think when Preacher Hall was here back in the late 30s, early 40s, they built the white part on the back that we had the baby building in. So you had Sunday school classes. So you had the old church. Then later on, they put some Sunday school buildings behind it, if you remember. Now then, those buildings had only brick foundation. And the brick foundation under that part of the building looked surprisingly like the bricks that were connecting the fieldstone columns. So how many of you remember the old timers? And I won't say who you are, but Ken and the other people will remember this for sure. Remember when you had an old building that had just a fieldstone or and sometimes cinder block, foundation. Then they would come in because of rodents and the bad air, you would put the brick in between them. And often you could still see buildings that are like that. Y'all probably had to move buildings like that where they would have those two different foundations. So my suspicion is that that's how it got that foundation. But I thought it was a great story because the story goes in it that they were compromised. So it became a characteristic of New Prospect Church that when we had a controversy come up, they were going to remember the rock foundation as opposed to the brick foundation because they made it work without splitting the church. And so anyway, that's where that story goes. Go on to the next slide here. And let me say something here briefly about alcohol. Obviously, at this time of period, you're in before the Great War, the First World War, alcohol was a big issue. Now then, if you study history, you know that before the Civil War, alcohol was a huge problem. I mean, and you had trouble. I remember stories about having revivals, where they would get drunk, because they were, outside revival, meeting and they brought their apple cider or whatever they had. And so it became an issue in the church. And so even before Prohibition was making a big splash nationwide, it became a big issue for the church. So the association and our church, back in the early 20s, whatever it says up there, they made a public statement that alcohol would not be a part of the church. And that was before Prohibition. But it was actually, Anderson County had prohibited the sale of alcohol before Prohibition actually took in. We became like a dry county before the Prohibition. Of course, it happened, Prohibition, of course, eventually be repealed. But I want to make that statement because that's at the point where the church made a statement about alcohol use in the church. Prior to that, there wasn't that big of a deal. Reading the story of Fanny Crosby was not unlike her to have a nip of wine and stuff like that, because it was just not something that they thought about. But as it got to be an issue with alcoholism and et cetera, the church came out forcefully against it. My hometown is Demorest. Have any of you been to Demorest, my hometown? Some of you have been in the Demorest. It's a beautiful little town down there, okay? William Jennings Demorest was a prohibitionist from New York City, and he was a publisher. And people wanted to have an ideal town where they have no liquor and no prostitution, and so they started an ideal town. No gambling, no liquor, no prostitution, no gambling. and they founded the town of Demorest, and they named it after this great prohibitionist leader from New York City, William Jennings Demarest. So I grew up in a prohibitionist town. It is not a prohibitionist town anymore. Every establishment in Demorest is selling beer. In fact, one of the premier eating establishments is now in Demorest. So if you want, I'll tell you how to get to it. Everything is grown in the farm to table thing. So everything is grown in that farm, both the meat and the everything, except for the wines that they get from Helen in that area. But all of it's grown within 7 miles of Demorest, and they serve it there. And people come up from Atlanta and everywhere else. It's a big deal. Anyway, go to the next slide here. This continues telling about that. Let me say another thing here. It was about this time that we started having most of the churches were having a midweek prayer meeting. We did not do that according to Jimmy Creamer's research. We did not start having a midweek service until after the World War II. Go ahead to the next slide. Now then, this is kind of important. I'm glad we got to it. The Women's Missionary Union, we had always been a church of mission giving from the very beginning. As I mentioned to you earlier, some churches were not. So you had missionary churches and non-missionary churches. You had missionary churches and more Calvinistic churches that didn't support, sending missionaries out. We always did. And so the WMU was started as a way of trying to support missionaries all the way back to Lottie Moon. When Lottie Moon was one of our first missionaries that went to China, she needed help financially. So the women, started in South Carolina, got together and said, we're going to support you. And it took an offering over Christmas to help Lottie Moon. And then from that, we have the Women's Missionary Society, and that became the WMU eventually. Go to the next slide. Now then, it becomes interesting here because there's a good chance that we started our missionary union here is because of Janie Chapman. Do any of you recognize that name? The Janie Chapman, what? Missionary offering, state mission for state missions. Janie Chapman was a pastor's wife at the First Baptist Church of Anderson. And she became a very, very strong proponent of local missions and state missions. And so she was influential, came to churches, including here. And I think when was it, the 30s, they started the organization here, and whatever the details of that are. And so I think she was one of the leading people, not only in the state, but locally and even here in our own church. And as probably most of you know, she's buried in Old Silverbrook Cemetery here in Anderson. So that's where she is laid to rest. Go on to the next one for me. The Spanish flu, you know the history of the Spanish flu. The only thing is that it did affect us here at the church. They had several people who died from that, and that, of course, was right after the First World War. And by the way, we had several people who ended up going to the war, and when they came back, they were all that was part of what made that pandemic just mushroom, because they call it the Spanish flu, but it was not necessarily from Spain. In fact, it's possible that it came from one of our army bases here in America. And so it's possible that we actually took the Spanish flu from the Midwest to Europe and back again. So if you study that pandemic, you'll learn about that. But there are several people in the church who died. Several people were made sick by it. The difference in that pandemic and our pandemic is that they didn't have any restrictions. Most of them didn't know what was going on. People just got sick. They didn't know it was worldwide. I mean, CNN News had not started yet. And so all they had was local papers who were not really picking up on it. So people were getting sick, not even knowing that they had a national pandemic going on. And so, but we were involved in that. Going to the next slide. And like I say, I mentioned here about those who went to war. Ernest Creamer. I remember Ernest. I was not here. Well, maybe I guess I was here when Ernest was still living. And but Ernest Creamer was our oldest World War I veteran here. And then we had two who died in Wilbanks and Murphy. Both were killed in combat during World War One, and we had several families who were over there. And again, it's a similar thing. We don't have a whole lot of details about it, except that we know that those families are involved. Let me tell you that some of the history that they got in the 88 histories that you have a copy of there actually came from family records, like what Othello was talking about. So some of you have family records of the Creamers and the McLeans. And oh, by the way, I realized that through the McLeans, Mary Frances, James Burris, not James Burris, John Burris, who we talked about last year. Jacob Burris. Well, Jacob Burris was our founder. His dad, James Burris, is who we're talking about. James Burris was one of the founders of First Baptist Church in Anderson, and it'd be Jacob's father. But it's my understanding that Mary Frances, when they look back, tell me that it was her great-great-great-great-grandfather, right? Which means that through the McLeans somehow. And so that the McLean family and possibly others go all the way back to the founding of our town. Before Anderson was a town, families were here. What else did I have in that little slide there? We talked about. Go ahead to the next one. Now then, here's E.C. White. We talked about him a while ago, right? So he had a strong influence on Baptists in general here, and so he was here during the 20s, and he was a very, very popular, dynamic, forgive me for using this phrase, but hellfire and damnation preacher, right? Like my grandfather, He would slap the pulpit. My grandfather would preach, and he would one foot here and one hemp on the pulpit. That's the kind of preacher that E.C. White is, as far as I know. Now then, though, it was Reverend Rains who made a big impact on the church. Go to the next slide. I could not find a picture of Reverend Rains, so it is not up there. But go on to the next slide. There's some material there. So Luther Henry Rains, L.H. Rains, he and his wife started a school up in Long Creek, up in Oconee County. And they were, he was the first educated, I'll say highly educated, pastor that we had here. And he was bivocational, as were all of the pastors. We had no full-time pastors up to that point. And Dr. Rains, or Reverend Rains, attended, guess where? Furman University. So he was a Puritan, if they called them Puritans back in those days, I don't know. But he also went to, guess where? Southern Seminary, and got his advanced degrees from Southern Seminary. Does that sound familiar to you guys? Because, of course, Dr. Cribb, but also Reverend Shirley had that same pedigree. So all of a sudden now we have an educator who is here as a bivocational pastor, Reverend Rains. And he would make the drive twice a month from Long Creek. You know where Long Creek is, right? If you ever go up there to get apples. It's a long way. It's about like what I have to drive every, day. 58 miles to my house, in case you're interested. So 58 miles. It's 58 miles from my house to here, and it is 57.6 miles for me to start here and go back home. I don't know why that is, but anyway. I think it has something to do with the interchange in Livonia or something. I don't know. But anyway, he made that trip back and forth for 15 years. That was a long time. And he established a teaching ministry at this church that I think is being carried on today. All of a sudden, now then, it was more important what we knew about the Bible than just rhetoric about the Bible. And so that's the heritage of our church here. Now then, at the end of his time, at the end of the Depression, he started realizing that this church was growing to the point that it needed a full-time pastor. And so go to the next slide for me. Yeah, here we go. Let me say one other thing about this time during the Depression. I told you that they had preaching here twice a month. But they had Sunday school every Sunday. And they also had singing every Sunday. And Willie Harbin was the one that people remember most about being the song leader. And so, you know, Cecil Harbin, that's his father. Remember Caroline Davis? That's her father. And he would, Cecil told me stories about being here with his dad. One of them I thought was fantastic because I asked him years and years ago, this is years ago, I asked Cecil what it was like on December the 7th, 1941, here at New Prospect Church. What was it like that day? And so he told me all the details. He would have to come up here and they'd light the fire in the old building early, and they would go home and come back for Sunday school, and have the church warm in the old white building. And so that, but he was a song leader. So when people came in, he led the singing. And it was said that the preacher would come in at, sometimes late, right? It's a long way to take a Model T or a Model A Ford, that distance. And so they would sing until he got there. And so that's one reason the church got to be where it's a singing church. Now, next week, you're going to see some pictures of the choirs that took place in the early 50s. They were huge. They were big. And I thought to myself, when I was here in the 80s, the choir was also big. But I realized that that's something that I didn't develop. I had inherited that. The 60 and 70 voice choirs, they were here in the 50s because everybody sang. So that's where we are. And so at the end of that time, the church called Reverend Hall. And Reverend Hall he was here part-time to begin with at the end of the Second World War. Then he became full-time. And so he was our first full-time pastor. And his wife was very active in his ministry here. And it was at that time that they were starting Vacation Bible Schools. They were starting different mission organizations, which had been kind of started, but they started the big time now because it's full-time ministry. And so he was here for a while, I don't know, 4 years, 5 years, something like that, whatever it would say there. And then he moved to another church. Then his son would become pastor of Barker's Creek Church. And so that's where you get our connection to Barker's Creek. So we have, lots of connections that way. And so that's where we were at the close of the Second World War. We now had a full-time preacher. Oh, and I meant to ask Susan. I don't think Susan is here because I want to make sure this is right. According to my material, he was the first person to occupy the pastorium. And is that right? Yeah. He was the first one to occupy the pastorium in the 1940s, late 1940s. After, and those of you knew, that the pastorium is church, the brick house right across from the daycare center there. And so he occupied it first. The Shirleys were there, obviously, are the longest. Bill Hudgens had been the last pastor there, and after Bill Hudgens left, then they sold it. And so when Eddie Green came in, he was the first person to get a stipend or a housing allowance, and he bought his own house. And so that's where we are. So next week when we come together, we're going to be talking about the explosive period of growth, and that was with Clarence Shirley. And now then we're getting to the part where a lot of you participated in that. And so I'll be interested in comments. We're also getting to the part where I have a lot of images, photographs that I can identify. And so we'll put those into the slides. Is there any comments that anybody has or questions? Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you for correcting marking that. Yeah. Yeah. I actually think I have it in Joe in one place, Ernest in one place, and possibly Joe in the other. Oh, by the way, the other thing is, John, I saw 3 or 4 mistakes. I'm not going to tell you what my mistakes were. But I put this together so quickly. I've had a lot on my plate lately. Plus, I haven't been feeling all that well in the last week or so. But first thing Johnny noticed is on the first page there, it was what, 1844 to 18. Yeah, I went backwards. It should be 1944. But anyway, if I didn't have a mistake, it wouldn't be me, Don. Was it? Do you know when it was founded? Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that's right. It would be right close to Deep Creek Cemetery, at least what we think is Deep Creek Cemetery. And by the way, I remind you again, if any of you have any contacts with any of the universities or anybody, anthropology or whatever is working on this thing, I would love to have a team go in and actually make a project, may take 3 or 4 or 5 years, to see if they can identify those graves, because I think it'd be a great thing. Other question? Yeah, Ken? That's right. You'll see pictures of that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, really? Yeah. I. Yeah. Well, that's a great story, and I don't remember, he'd been serving for 20 or 25 years, and they bought him a new car. Just in case any of you are interested, I've been serving for about 20 or 25 years, and any other question? I know we had some people that need to. Any other question? Look forward to having next week, and if you have any questions, let me know. I'll be glad to try to answer them. Any other comments before we close? Let's bow in prayer. Father, thank you for being with us. We pray that you will bless our time together here, and we take a moment just to thank you, Lord, for the heritage of our church. Thank you for the people who laid the groundwork for our ministry here today. We could not have been doing what we're doing today if they had not done what they did years ago. Lord, we pray that you'll bless us, be with us this week. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you for being here.